Unfinished amazement. We're going to talk about miracles today. So I got to pick the scriptures, and so I picked 2 different gospel lessons. The Gospels are 4 books found at the beginning of the New Testament that are about the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. These are 2 different scriptures that will cover 3 different miracle stories, if that's what you want to call them. It's long, okay? We're in church. We're going to hear the Bible. Read along. They're good ones. These are good stories. These are good ones. So try to hang with it. Go ahead, Tracy.
After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhages stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
Give her something to eat. It's kind of my favorite part of that story. the question that children always ask when they hear these stories. Are miracles real? Or an even better question they ask, if miracles happened in the time of Jesus, why don't they happen today? I would like to state that this is one of the most important and deeply profound questions that any Christian can ask. Children are bold enough to do it. And it's really a shame that so many of us stopped asking this at some point. Perhaps the most deepest and honest theological questions about the nature of God, or wonderments about the Bible that we have as children. Those questions, the one we have as kids. Perhaps these are the kinds of questions that we should continue to ask as we grow in age, as we grow in life lessons, as we grow in faith. As we learn about new concepts and new ways to think about these amazing stories of Jesus, these miracles as they have been called. Today's theme in the Unfinished Sermon series is Unfinished Amazement, these ways that Jesus amazes us and how God is not finished with amazing us yet. And when the other pastors and I were looking over theme ideas for this series, and we got to this theme, the theme that would address the more miraculous parts of the life and ministry of Jesus, I got a bit nervous. Are we really going to talk about miracles during a generosity campaign? Would that suggest that if we give our finances to a cause, that Jesus will make miracles come raining down from the heavens into our lives? Does it suggest that people who give more money or time or heart or witness, will experience more miracles? Does it suggest that we can buy God's power or buy God's love? These, my beloved community, are very dangerous lines. These are the epitome, in my mind, of walking to the furthest edge of the line that a pastor can walk between good theology and spiritual manipulation. We just have to be so careful as religious leaders to explain that God's love and power can never be bought and that the grace of God extends to all people. You cannot earn God's grace, and your response to God's grace is not something you give to receive a reward. But that still doesn't answer our question. Where are the miracles today? How is God still amazing us? I'm going to bring you along through my thought process of answering that question when it pertains to these three different stories. It's two stories, but like three miracles. The feeding of the 5,000, the healing of the woman who bleeds, and the healing of Jairus' daughter. I think a good place to start is to compare these three different events from our scripture and to figure out kind of what's different about them and what's the same about them, okay? We did this in the Wednesday night class that I'm leading. And so we discussed first about what was kind of different about how Jesus does these miracles. In the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples kind of come to Jesus and they're like, how are we going to feed all these people? And Jesus kind of flips it and he's like, how are you going to feed all these people? And so they go and they scan the crowd of 5,000 people who all showed up for this day trip to see Jesus speak, but no one had any food with them. Only this one child thought to bring a meal, right? So Jesus takes the kids' lunch and multiplies it, and there's more than enough for everybody with 12 baskets of food left over. And there's always been that question that Bible folk ask. If Jesus actually multiplied the food, or if the community saw the generosity of the young boy and came together to give what they had after they witnessed that generosity. That's a great interpretation. But I want to be careful to not remove the amazement or the miraculous from this story. And what about the woman who was hemorrhaging, who touched Jesus' robe? He didn't even pick her. He turned around and said, "Who touched me?" It was her own faith that healed her. If I could just touch the hem of his robe, I will be healed. And with Jairus' daughter, the leader of the synagogue, the healing took place only once Jesus was in the same room. He held the hand. He said some like magical incantation, right? There had to be like this ritual behind it. So these miracles, they're very different as far as how Jesus does them. There's not this like trend or line that you can follow that says like, here's the thing that Jesus would do to heal or to create something great out of something not so great. So, these differences in this story allow us to kind of come to terms with it's not about how Jesus does these things, but what happened when he does. And so the thing that happens when he does the miracle, does these amazing things, that's what's similar about these stories. We're often under the impression that it is in these amazing abilities that Jesus has to heal that sets him apart from others. Like we hear these stories when we're kids about how Jesus could like raise the dead, and that's what made him so special. And that's why we should believe in Jesus and follow Jesus. What is actually very interesting is that in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century Palestine, there were a lot of people who wandered the land doing miracles. That was not unique. That was not unique. But what was unique is that usually the people that claimed to be able to do this always worked for the wealthy, or they only did this for the people who worshiped the same God as theirs, or they did it for money. So if you were in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Palestine and you heard these stories, what would amaze you about these stories would not be the actual physical miracles themselves. The amazing thing about these stories, the miraculous part of them, is that they are redemptive. That's an important word today, redemption. They are redemptive and they are non-hierarchical. Jesus would heal a woman who's considered unclean, or a child who have no place in society, or provide food for everyone regardless of class or who they were. That's crazy for this time period. Jesus would even associate with all these people. He would eat with these people. That's crazy. None of the gods were interested in that. None of the religious leaders had time for that. In each of these stories, the similarity is that God is offering redemption to all through Jesus. In each of these stories, all kinds of people are being made whole again. They're being restored back into the community. That's redemption. Not that like hocus pocus, your wounds are gone, but like those wounds can be redeemed and you can be part of us again. Like the hemorrhaging woman, for example. We know a few things about her from this story. She's had this illness for 12 years. Which in that culture means she would have been considered unclean and therefore probably was not touched for 12 years. Not a hug, not a hand on the shoulder. I want you to imagine what that would be like for any of us. Her physicians maybe would have touched her at times, but they would be expected to ritually bathe afterward. And it said that she had spent all of her money on these physicians trying to get better. Now, if a woman in this time period had her own money, which was very, very rare, this means she was upper class. This means she was upper echelon at one time in the community, but has since then spent everything she has had on trying to get better. She's lost everything from her health to her position in society, her money, and worst of all, I think, contact with another human. She sits on the outside of the community. There were rules about not touching the unclean. Rules that the Jewish people followed, that Jesus was supposed to follow. But when she touches Jesus' robe and she's healed, she is restored. And we know that for sure because he calls her daughter. In that culture and in that language, that is only a term you use for the members of the community, of the tribe. She had been redeemed back into relationship with others, with creation, her own flesh, and with God. And when we hear her story, she becomes redemption for those of us who can relate to her, who've had illnesses similar, or who sit on the outskirts of society, those who do not have a place in community. And that is the amazing good news. And what about the little girl who's also restored to community from death? We have very different views of children these days as they did back then. And the idea that when an innocent child is lost, that God is present, and God is not okay with it, and God is not done with that story, matters. Children had no place in the world in the time of Jesus. But in the Gospels, Jesus makes it very clear that God does indeed have a place for children and a special place for those who suffer. And that is redemptive for anyone who has lost a child or has seen their baby suffer, or for our young people who are so often hurting without anyone noticing. And then the little boy with the loaves and fishes. What we do know for sure is that 5,000 people could not figure out how to feed each other. And that when the disciples of Jesus, the religious leaders, tried to help, they too could not figure out how to get everybody fed. But when Jesus got involved, not only did they manage to feed every single person there, they had more than enough for everybody, and they still had leftovers, which is the redemption of an entire community who, maybe they want to hold on to the little they have. Maybe we're stingy for good reasons. Maybe, the guy over there had tons of food he's not sharing, but I only have this. But when everybody with Jesus at the center was able to make that happen, that is redemptive. That crosses lines that have not been crossed. That brings something new into communities. It redeems our cynicism that systems are broken and ineffective. It redeems our sense of community and coming together. Whether you were the person who had a lot or nothing to share that day, everybody got fed. Jesus doesn't amaze us in a vacuum. He amazes us in community. He brings people into community or back into community that were on the outskirts. He brings all the people together to feed each other and to figure out how to accomplish a goal together. And that is amazing. How many places can you think of just in our country right now in our politics where people cannot bring it together? That is hopeful. That is amazing. That is miraculous. It's not like this is the first time period that had divisions. We don't give to Jesus, to God, to the church, so that God or Christ can wave a magical wand and everything will get better. It's not about magic. If it was about magic, then why would God become human? True redemption for this world, true redemption for the suffering of this world, has to involve God redeeming the human condition. True redemption redeems our wounds, the ones that we bear, and the ones that we have inflicted. It restores all of us back into community. And that is what made the Gospels and the stories of Jesus stand apart from all of the other ones that were circulating in the 1st through 3rd century Palestine, and a couple centuries before. We don't give some of what we have so that we can receive a miracle. If I said that, I'd probably make a lot more money and be on TV. But we don't give what we have, time, of finances, or anything. We don't do that so we can receive a miracle. We give because we can be a part. We can become a piece of God's miracle that can reach everyone. So where are the miracles today? If you were hoping for some magic, some hocus pocus, I don't have that to offer you. And I am truly convinced that if that's the only thing we consider miraculous, then we are going to miss the true miracles that happen around us. You've got to look past that and find the deeper redemptive thing, for the redemption, the resurrection is the miracle. So I don't have magic or hocus pocus to offer. Here's what I got. Here's my example. Can you put the slide up? 2.5 weeks ago, my husband Andy was in a car accident. He spun out and flipped our car and shut down Interstate 55 for 45 minutes. He crawled out of the upside-down car through the window and was able to clutch onto the 1.5-foot space between the fast lane and the median. 2 middle-aged black men on their way to work stopped traffic and helped him across the highway to the shoulder. They called 911 and they called me. These 2 men probably saved his life. And then one of the EMTs on the scene happened to be an old friend of mine from a church. I've known him for 15 years. He had my number in his cell phone. He was able to call me as I was flipping out on my way to the hospital to assure me that Andy was okay. I said, John, I know you have to say that. And he's like, he can move all 4 of his limbs and he is conscious. Which was like a huge sigh of relief, right? Our parents stepped up immediately to watch our babies. Andy's work showed up to the hospital with the paperwork that we needed to start filling out so he could receive short-term disability. And they brought groceries too. He works at Trader Joe's. They brought groceries. The monastic order that I am part of immediately set up a babysitting rotation to make sure someone could be with our children at nighttime, because my friend Hannah knew there was no way I could handle walking back in my home without Andy in tow with me. They also figured out who was going to mow our lawn that Saturday and clean our house. But Andy walked away with whiplash, bruises, and cuts, and 1 broken kneecap. That's it. He's in an isolation cast and his arms are sore. And that was amazing. And that was miraculous. Yeah, it's one thing if Jesus would have hocus pocused Andy's wounds away. It is an entirely different thing to witness the redemption of those wounds through a God that restores you to community when you have suffered. These are the miracles: the strangers who stop on the highway, the friends who show up, the faith community that reaches out and starts the meal train and sends you cards and makes sure to cover your work when it's been a rough week. We see you. I see you. And I am amazed. This is our unfinished amazement. It's the way that everybody's a part of it. Children of God, the miracles are the way that Jesus brings us together in new ways to redeem the suffering of this world and to restore all of us back into community together. Last page. Dramatic pause. And when God, at the center of our community, is able to restore us all back together, then we will be amazed. We will be amazed that we will be able to witness that a 12-year-old girl does not have to die. A woman who has been sick and suffering for 12 years can find and get the access to the treatment that she needs to be healed. And that everyone can be fed. And there will still be leftovers. there will be more than enough for everyone if we only allow God to amaze us. Amen.